I agree. When I did the job 2 cycles ago, I went through the whole Yavamas, and it was geschmack.
Yeah?
It wasn't so difficult.
Okay.
We need
Once you get
diagrams.
past the 40, 50 block in the beginning, it's not so.
We need diagrams for some of the pages, but they're not difficult.
Okay.
Let's learn Torah.
Can you do me a favor? You know the Zoom link that you have? Can you just resend it to the chat?
So
Do you know how to do
yeah.
You just forward it to the Daf Yomi
Okay,
chat.
I think I know how to do that.
Because Akiva asked for it, and okay,
Forward to.
there you go. All right, we're holding Chavdalit. We're holding technically 2 lines at the bottom of Gimel on the base. A bunch of Mishnayos on today's daf. That's usually a sign that it's an easy daf, because it means it's short. There's a lot of very juicy things on the daf, but every daf's like that, I think. Okay. Mishnah says, it's very quick, very, very quick Hakdama, just a reminder. Right, so back in the times of the Mishnah, back in the times when after Moshe and Ezra were metaken the concept of Kriyas HaTorah, initially the way the minhag for Kriyas HaTorah went was that you had, again, if you understand that it's a kiyum of Talmud Torah de Rabbim, which is how we're going to understand it, then the understanding is that the goal of Kriyas HaTorah isn't just like a mitzvah in shul, it's a requirement to be maidia the inyanim that are going on in Torah and Nevi'im to the kihila. So what they would do is they would have a person be oila, whether he was kairei or eventually they had a bal kriya who would be kairei. But regardless, the job of the bal kairei, the job of the kairei is to teach the nation what's going on in the Torah. Now, obviously, as people became less and less familiar with Lashon HaKodesh, it became more and more important to translate a la Steinsaltz, Art Scroll, however you want to speak about it today. Similar idea, they would have a Meturgaman get up and effectively tell over Targum Onkelos. Now the question became, obviously we want to be mefarish the words properly, and the Meturgaman is going to basically be doing it bal peh. So an issue came up, which is not every Meturgaman, which is not exactly the most mechubedik job. You're basically sort of almost like a little bit of a schlep for the shul to get up there and try to explain everything. It's not like he was saying drushes and getting covered as a rav. He was literally just saying shot in the milah. So we really needed to make sure that we weren't going to overburden him in a way that it was going to make it difficult for him to explain it, and he wouldn't make mistakes. Now, the reason why mistakes matter are because when you're coming to psukim in the Torah, there are halachas that come out of those psukim, and if there are halachas that come out of those psukim, and you make a mistake about, I don't know, which animal's kosher, which animal's not kosher, we need to know which animal it is so that you don't go home and cook the wrong animal. Mashen came in Nevi'im, not so much. So the Mishnah is going to tell us as follows. First things first, the halacha that you're not supposed to have less than 3 psukim. In an aliyah, this was really a takanas Ezra, more than a takanas Moshe Rabbeinu. And, okay, fine. When the Meturgaman would explain it, he would hear the Balkaira say one pasuk, and then he would go one pasuk. One pasuk, one pasuk, one pasuk, one pasuk. Masha'inkin, as we turn to the top of Chatal and Madalev, ubin navi shleisha. And again, what it means over here is if you want to have a Meturgaman go 1 and 1, 1 and 1, you can. What it's saying here is the cap, the limit to how many psukim will allow the Balkaira to read before we require or allow the Meturgaman to go explain everything is 3.
I told you Navi.
That's a Navi. In Torah, it's 1, right? So Torah is 1 pasuk, and in Navi, it's 3 psukim. And again, the distinction between the Torah and the Nevi'im is, like I said before, that by Torah, there's halachic nafkaminas, whereas by Nevi'im, there aren't. It's stories. So why is there a limit at all? And the answer is obviously we don't want, the whole purpose is that people should understand what's going on. We want to have an accurate telling over of whatever's going on in the Kriya. The problem, though, is that we don't want to have an overburdensome Meturgamans, required to have to remember the last 6 psukim and then have to explain it. So therefore, by Nevi'im, we capped it at 3. How you shlushed on sholosh parshas, let's say the Nevi'im, meaning by the Haftarah, each of these 3 psukim were 3 separate inyanim. The way it says in the Mishnah is there were 3 parshas, but the Rishonim speak out, it doesn't mean actual paragraphs in the Torah or in the Nevi'im. It means 3 inyanim separate. And again, this is related to the same idea. The Meturgaman's explaining things. Not only do we not want to tax him in explaining it, we don't want to tax the people listening that they should be jumping from one inyan to another inyan in a way that it's not clear. So therefore, we would always have the Meturgaman finish when an idea finished.
So
So
you're not following inside,
well, there's no inside to follow. So exactly, they don't have actual chumashim the way we have. They don't even have chumashim in the way the times of the Gemara had, which were actual scrolls. They're literally just listening, so it's much more important. Which just reminds me of something we said yesterday, which is why whenever someone speaks, it's just I find this to be a pet peeve, maybe not. I think generally speaking, unless the words you're going to be reading inside are so imperative for the idea you're saying, when you're speaking over, you're saying a speech, you're giving advice, Torah, don't read inside. Do not read inside. If you can avoid reading inside, avoid reading inside. People's brain, the second you turn your face down to the book, they're done. They're not interested. It's the same thing over here. The Meturgaman, his job was basically almost not even like a Talmud Chacham. His job was to be an entertainer. Yeah, the guy's making a pasuk. The pasuk, they're not listening. It's hard to. His job was to be like, hey guys, let me explain to you what's going on over here in the pasuk. Moshe Rabbeinu just da-da-da-da, and he went like this. Next pasuk. Okay, what happened after that was, because otherwise it's just very difficult for people to pay attention. Either way, continues the Mishnah. Kairin echad echad, then meaning hayu shlosh and sholosh parshas kairin echad echad. If the ideas were split up, then it would go back to the din of the Torah where you'd go one pasuk at a time. Now next halacha, medalgin benavi vein medalgin b'Torah, that when we do kriyas Torah, you have to go in order. You don't jump around from one parsha to another parsha. You don't jump around from one idea to another idea. If you can avoid it, we'll see in the Gemara that there are times that we do. The Mishnah here is specifically talking about a unique scenario. However, when you're medalig in Navi, ad kama, hu medalig, ad kedei shaloi yifsak ha-meturgaman. So again, just summary of the Mishnah. We're talking really about all of the dinim of the meturgaman. His job was to explain what's going on in the psukim. We care very much about getting it accurate. So therefore, even by Nevi'im, we don't let him go more than 3 psukim. But by Torah, where there's a halachic ramification, there we limit him to only 1 pasuk at a time, because we don't want the tzibur to not understand what's going on and make mistakes. In the same vein that we want to make sure they understand what's going on, we don't jump around inside of a Navi or inside of a Torah, or let's say Kriyas Torah we don't, and Nevi'im we do, but even the dilug of the Nevi'im is limited from the amount of time that it's going to take to go from the Meturgam and finish speaking. Therefore, we try to keep that to a minimum as well. So there's 2 ideas that come out in the Mishnah. Idea number 1 is making sure that the tzibur understands, okay? And there's a little bit of a maila in the Nevi'im in that it's not really halachic nafkaminas. The second idea is, well, when you're skipping around, what's the shiur of the gap between one skip to the other? There we don't want there to be too much time that if the Meturgaman finishes explaining the prior pasuk, and now the tzibur sitting around staring up at the walls, waiting for you to scroll it to the point where now you can continue reading, they're going to be b'shtika. Rashi says over here a very interesting lashon. He says, "Zemishum she'aint kavod tzibur la'amud sham b'shtika," which to me is a pelagic thing about such a tzibur. What it's basically saying is, they'd read a pasuk, or let's say Nevi'im, they'd read 3 psukim maybe. The Meturgaman would then say those 3 psukim, and then maybe they would jump from the beginning of Yehoshua to the end of Yehoshua. That might take, let's say, a minute and a half, a minute, whatever. It's not a kavod l'tzibur to be la'amud sham b'shtika. So does it mean that they were b'shtika, or does it mean that the person standing up there was b'shtika, meaning they're just sitting there not doing anything? It's not a kavod to the tzibur to make them wait. I mean, it sounds like it's a tier for the tzibur with nothing going on, right?
It's like in shuls that don't have enough Torahs and they're rolling. Right.
And then
everyone starts talking.
Exactly, right. Yeah. Okay, so Lamaisi, you have 2 dinim. You have the din of making sure the tzibur understands what's going on, and then you have the din of making sure there's no tier for the tzibur. And we'll see that kavod tzibur plays a huge role, came out in all of these halachas of Kriyas Torah, as we'll see. Hani gimel psuk, and then we're going to ask Kenegin me. It's a little bit of a difficult question. We've already sort of discussed this, but really what we were talking about before was, why are there 3 aliyahs? Now we're saying, why are there 3 psukim? Ravasi Kenegin Torah Nevi'im Ksuvim, same answer. He's the same word who says the same answer before. Then it said in the Mishnah, "V'lo yikra le'meturgam and yoismi pasuk echad," that the meturgam shouldn't go more than 1 pasuk by Torah, but by Nevi'im it's gimel psukim. V'im hayu shlashtan shalish parshas kairei echad echad. So the Gemara gives an example. Kagain. What's the example? Kikaya mar Hashem mechinam nimchartem. This is a psukim in Yeshaya where 1 pasuk into the next is basically 3 separate inyanim. The second pasuk is Kikaya mar Hashem Elokim Mitzrayim Yorad. I'm not sure Yorad. Ami Berishayna. Ve'atam alipai lu'masham. Fine. You have 3 psukim in a row in Yeshaya where it talks about 3 separate inyanim. Medalgim and Navi and Medalgim and Torah. It says you could skip around by Nevi'im but you can't skip around by Kriyas HaTorah. Right, the Gemara, 1 second, meaning so we know that the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur would read from the Torah. He would start reading from Achrei Mos, and then he would go a couple of parshas later into Parshas Emor and start reading from the Asar, where we're talking about all of the mitzvahs of the day of fasting and chulu v'chulu. You see, he's jumping around. So we just said in the Mishnah that you can't be jumping around by Torah. The Gemara seems to answer exactly what we answered in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that that's the explanation for the Shiur for Nevi'im, and by Torah, there would seem to be, there was no skipping around. Abaye is answering, no, our Mishnah that says you can't skip around just means you can't skip around a length of time that the rolling up to the next point would take longer than the Meturgaman finishing the prior pasuk. But as long as it's within that period of time, it's okay for the Gemara. What do you mean? It says in the Mishnah you could be medalig ben navi, and it says ve'ein medalgin b'Torah, and you want to explain it the way we just explained it. But then it says ve'ad kamahu medalig, which is obviously going on the Mishnah itself, where it's talking about Nevi'im, and it says ad kedei shelo yifsak haTorguma, which is mashma that, well, that's what they'll say. Meaning, but the point of it here in the Gemara is ad kedei shelo yifsak haTorguma sounds like that's only going by the Nevi'im. Is michlal de b'Torah klalu klaloi? So how can you tell me that you can skip around by Torah? Now the question's a little bit difficult because, I mean, the Gemara is clearly bringing a case that they did skip around, and they clearly did skip around. So we're trying to answer that up.
We don't do that. On Yom Kippur, we go from...
The Kohen Gadol when he reads. The Kohen Gadol when he reads. The Kohen Gadol when he reads, meaning we don't have...
Ideally, we
That's
don't
not
want,
clear,
ideally, we don't want this brisa to conflict with the Stam Mishnah. We
Right.
want it to be consistent.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, so that's what I was going to say. Okay, so yeah, so the point over here is this brisa, which is telling me that we clearly do skip, and our Mishnah, which is saying we clearly don't skip, Abaye's initial teretz of saying, oh, no, this is talking about a smaller shear, and that's talking about a bigger shear. So meaning the jump from Achrei Mos to 1.5 parshas later, that's not a big deal. That probably takes 2 seconds. By the time the Meturgaman's explaining, finishing what's going on in the prior pasuk, they'll already be there. Masha'en Keni, if you're talking about making a bigger jump, I don't know, you're going from Parshas Shmos to Parshas Bahar, maybe something like that would be a big deal, would take too long, and that's not a cover to the tzibur. But the Gemara says from the Mishnah itself, it's clear that the only time that the shear is given is as it relates to Nevi'ah, but not Torah. So the Gemara says, you're right. I'll explain it to a different way. Kan be'inyan echad and kan b'shtei inyanos. What it means to say is that la'olam, you can skip around in Torah as long as you're going from one inyan, me'inyan la'osa inyan. If you're going from Inyana Yom Kippur in Achrei Mos to Inyana Yom Kippur in Parshas Emor, that's not a problem, even if it's going to be some skipping around, right? But if you're going to be jumping from, Rashi says over here, from Negoyim to Zavim, or I forget which example he gives, which to me it just sounds like all one inyan anyways, because I don't understand one, I don't understand the other. But from the perspective of people who understand the halacha, that's two completely separate areas in Shulchan Aruch, two different prakim in the Rambam. That already you're not going to be jumping around. Now, it's important to point out over here that the Gemara is not coming off of the shear that Abaye gave. Meaning, clearly, the way we'll read the Mishnah now is when it says in the Mishnah you could jump around by Torah, it means you could jump around from one inyan in the same inyan, and by Nevi'im you could jump around even from something that is a different inyan. But regardless of which one you're talking about, that skipping as a tircha de tzibura issue doesn't change. There we'll say that you can't go too long where the previous pasuk is finished by the Meturgaman and you're still rolling to get to that next spot. Bahatanya here is benichusa. It's not a kasha, it's a raya. Bahatanya v'dalgin b'Torah b'inyan echad b'navi b'shnei yonim, like I just said. Kan v'kan b'chdei shelo yifsak haMeturgaman, and both have the same shear of the Meturgaman. Now let's continue to the Mishnah. Tanya idich a brisa in the same exact inyan, where it continues and says ein medalgin minavi lenavi, which the pashtus means that although we're just said two moments ago that you can skip around in the kriya of the haftarah, with the skipping around is to stay within one sefer. So if you're in Yehoshua, you could jump around a little bit in Yehoshua, but to jump from Yehoshua to Shoftim, from Malachim to Shmuel, that you can't do. And then the way they read the Gemara now is like this: Ubinavi shall shneim asar medalik. If you're talking about trei asar, you have, trei asar balpeh?
I used to.
Yeah, when you were a kid, right? I still have it in my head as a song, right? Yeah. So, Yaina Micha, Nachum Chabakuk.
And then Chagai Zachari
Tzani Chagai Zachari Malachi. Those are the two. Okay. So, Ein Medalgim Menavi Umenavi shall shneim asar medalik, meaning the chiddush there is it's a caveat in the first halach. I just said 2 seconds ago you can't jump from one navi to another navi. So here you have two neviim that really is sort of like viewed in halacha as part of one sefer. So that maybe you could do. However, now this next line is a little bit difficult. Which the simple reading of the Gemara sounds like just don't go from Malachi to Hosea. But that doesn't make sense because I'll tell you why. Because Malachi to Hosea, let's say it would be the other way. Let's say go Hosea to Malachi. The Gemara is saying it's a problem going backwards. The example it's giving, if it's talking about the Treyasar, would be a problem if you'd be going forwards.
Oh.
Because if you're going from Hosea to Malachi, you're jumping a significant amount of time. That's clearly going to be longer than the time it takes the Meturgman to go. So that'll be problematic for another reason. So that clearly can't be what the Gemara means. The Rishonim speak out of here a couple of different mahalachim, but the basic idea of what they say is that what the Gemara means to say is it's all coming off of the first statement of the Tanya. It says that you could skip around, in like the din of the Mishnah is you could skip around the Nevi'im. What does it say? But you can't go from one Navi to another Navi. And on that, what it's saying is, meaning there's an implication there. You can't jump around from Navi to Navi, but within one Navi you can jump around. And the Ubilvad is saying on that halacha, Ubilvad, the jumping around inside a Navi, is don't go start at the end of the Navi and then jump to the beginning. If you're going to do it, start in the beginning and then go to the end. I mean, it's just telling you the order needs to be adjusted. The other Rishonim, Mahal from the Rishonim, but we don't have to really spend too much time on it. I'm thinking they I don't remember where I saw it. I may have seen it in the art scroll or I heard it. That one example where we actually are midaleg in Torah, besides now, we don't do this, right? This Achrei Meissen Amar is on a Tainus Tzibur. On a Tainus Tzibur, we lane from Kisisa, we lane Vayichal Moshe, but then we jump from Vayichal Moshe, which I think it's my bar mitzvah question, I know it. It's Lamed Gimel, and then it jumps to Lamed Dalet by saying Zolach, right? That's a jump. How can you jump? Teretz is it's close enough that there's not going to be a problem of the Tzibur, and it's in the same inyan. So therefore, it's no problem.
But does the maftir on every yontif count as a dilug? In other words,
so no, I'm bringing a raya from there that's by Torah, meaning that's by Chris Torah itself.
The maftir. So you do whatever parsha, then you do a parsha about karbanos, which is far away. So I'm saying, how does that?
Right. So it's clear that in the times of the Gemara, the maftir wouldn't be laning from somewhere else. The maftir would be laning from that parsha, or at least within this shear. Nowadays, we're splitting it up anyways with a Chatzi Kaddish, and it's almost like a separate inyan. There's no Tirch Tzibura anymore because it's not like we're sitting around waiting on Kriyas HaTorah, which again comes back to the conversation earlier about whether Haftarah is Oil Minyan, not Oil Minyan. Our meaning nowadays seems to be choshish that he is Oil Minyan, but at the same time we are choshish for the tzad that he's not Oil Minyan, so therefore we have.
Once in a while, there's still it's like when it's
Shabbos, if it's very far,
the triple Torah situation.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is,
but that Tirch Tzibura isn't this Tirch Tzibura. That's a Tirch Tzibura of that's an unavoidable Tirch Tzibura.
But we do a dilug. I'm saying we don't seem to hold that our landing has to be continuous. You can do a dilug.
You're talking about when it's a day like a Rosh Chodesh that falls on a.
Yeah, when the Shvi is in a different spot, and then the maftir
is in a different spot. Yeah,
there must have been just we paskin like the other day.
Well, I'm not 100% sure how it comes out completely la halacha, but it seems that the Tirch Tzibura is something that when we're discussing it in a shul where you have no alternative, I mean, it's also Tirch Tzibura to sit through Chazar Shat sometimes. I mean, you have to know like what that level of Tirch Tzibura is. Meaning, one of the discussions of Tircha Tzibura or Kavod Tzibur is, let's say, for instance, we're going to see in the Gemara a Kvad Peh, person who's, let's say, a little slow in the way he speaks, or maybe he doesn't speak nicely, or he doesn't have a nice voice. You have to know, what things are avoidable, what things are not avoidable.
Excluded. Some rabbis' sermons are Tircha Tzibura. So
that's true.
So it's just a fact that people are used to it.
Yeah, well, that's why thank God nowadays we have many shuls, we have a lot of options. Either way, let's go back to the Mishnah. Mishnah says Rabbi has to go, so I don't want to cover a little bit. 10 minutes.
No worries.
I'm after B'Navi who payris al Shema. We discussed before pre-sale on Shema. This is talking about if someone comes late to shul, they daven at home b'yachidus, but they want to catch Baruch Hu, they want to be yotze a little bit to Birchas Krishma. So the halacha is very interesting. We would take people from shul where there's a minyan, and we would say Baruch Hu, you say Kaddish, Baruch Hu, and then you say the first bracha in Birchas Krishma. Bracha is Yotzer Ma'oris, and we'll see why that's important in a moment. So the person who's mafter b'navi, the understanding over here, by the way, is not that such a chashuv thing. Being mafter b'navi was not considered a chashuv thing. It's considered almost not a bizayin, but it's almost like, that's the covenant you gave me, the one that's not even really oil and minyan. It's sort of like considered not the chashuv thing. Although Nowadays, it's the exact opposite. The guy who gets maftir outside of Shlishi is pretty much the most important thing because you've been chabbing him with the Haftarah. Everyone gets to hear his beautiful voice, whatever. He's going to daven most of the Amud. But times in the Gemara, it wasn't considered a chashva thing. So therefore, to almost, sweeten the deal by asking him to be the maftir, we would also say he could be the one to be Pyrus al Shema. And we would tell him, you know what, you could also daven for the Amud Musaf. And if he's a Kayan, he's the one who duchens. The Rishonim go to more the Achronim here. What is this talking about? If he's a Kayan, even if he didn't.
Oh, it sounds like only one coin was designated.
Oh, so you're saying
it sounds like.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
So the Nitziv, I think it's the Nitziv, other Achronim, they bring from here a little raya. Yeah. If that was the minig, they want to bring a raya from here that you can have a Kayan being mitzi another Kayan with Shemei Ka'ina. Because that means, meaning the way he understands it is what do you need a Mishnah to teach me? Meaning there are the Kohanim. And you're telling me that he's the one who gets to go up. If he's the one who gets to go up, how is he mitzi these other Kohanim? But Shemei Ka'ina, how can you say Shemei Ka'ina for the din of Birchas Kayan? And Birchas Kayanim has a specific halacha that not only that you say it, but it has to be done by Kol Ram. So this gets into that very famous Chakira in the halacha of Shemei Ka'ina. Does Shemei Ka'ina mean that by me hearing you speak, it's like I'm speaking? But I don't get all of the accoutrements that come along with your speech. So for instance, by Kiddush, when someone holds a kais, it has to be said al ha-kais. If I'm not holding a kais while you say Kiddush, how am I yotze Kiddush if I need to be saying it al ha-kais? Well, if Shemei Kain is just my dibur, then you're right, it's a problem. But if you understand that what's really happening here is almost like a shlichus type of halacha, that when it comes to mitzvahs that require speech, your speech accomplishes my responsibilities, then maybe it's enough that you're holding the cup. It's enough that you're doing it b'kol ram. So it's a big discussion over here, a very geschmacka discussion. There's a famous Beis Halevi that goes on this. There's a Chazon Ish that talks about this. They talk about it when it gets Sphere Seimer. Can you be mitzi someone with Sphere Seimer? Counting. Is counting just speech, or is counting something beyond speech? So there's a lot of these where that stuff like that comes up. But okay, fine. So what are we saying over here? Now, other Mefarshim in the Mishnah don't run into the issue. The Rashash says a very interesting thing. He says that it's talking about that you have a shliach tzibur, and what it's saying is what happens if he's the only shliach tzibur, he's the only kayan and he's the shliach tzibur. Mm-hmm. He reads the Mishnah very, very pashut, the Rashash he always does. V'hu oiver lifnei hateva means he's the chazan, not just for Musaf, but even maybe since he's going to be doing the haftarah, he's the one for shachris, and therefore v'hu noisi as kapov, when it comes time to duchening and not davening, he's a kayan. He's the only kayan there. What is he supposed to do? The Gemara says, I think it's in Brachas, the Gemara talks about if a person's the only kayan and he's the shliach tzibur, really he shouldn't go and duchen because we're nervous. He's not going to be able to figure out where he's supposed to come back to in the tefillah because it was all about pet. So what he's saying of the chiddush over here is that since he's the one who's the mafter, we want to give him a shtickle extra covet. We tell him that he can duchen, even though really we normally wouldn't say it. It's a different mahal. Neither way, very geschmack. The imhaya cotton. Let's say this person who's being maftir is the cotton, right? Then, the kayan. Who knows as kappa imhaya cotton. If there's cotton who's a kayan, who was maftir, who we would want him to be noisy as kapov, then we say aviv oy rabbi oyvern al yadai, and the mashmo says it seems that a cotton can't be noisy kapayim. Our minig, I think, is like that, right? We don't send the cotton up to do nisiyas kapayim. We do.
They go up.
Yeah.
I mean, in shuls that
only with their father.
Their father.
Do we ever send the cotton up by himself?
If the cotton was an orphan,
under 13 we do. Oh.
With other people.
Okay, I didn't know what the minute was. Yeah. So in Shulchan Aruch, the halacha comes out from Tosfos points out from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is very clearly mashma that a cotton doesn't duchen. And then there are two other places in Shas where it's mashma that a cotton does duchen, and then there's another place that's mashma even a gadol doesn't duchen until he grows a beard. 3 different places, and so the Tosfos explains that what it's saying is when you're a cotton mamish, you don't duchen at all, right? Meaning when you're mamish a cotton, right? Which says when does a cotton duchen? When he goes up with his father, meaning when he can't go by himself. He goes up with his father. It's like a chinuch dekahala. When he's by himself, a kain can't duchen. So our Mishnah is saying a cotton by himself can't duchen.
That he's the only cotton.
Only kain in the shul. A cotton doesn't go up
because he could go with someone else's father.
Yeah,
his father's
sick meaning if there's no other kahanim in the shul, then he doesn't go up. But once his father's going up, he can go up with him. Then it says that when he's a gadol, the Mishnah Gemara that says that you're not supposed to duchen. Tosfos explains it means he shouldn't duchen b'kfiyas. Why? Because it's not covered at tzibur that a person who's not a chashuv mensch has a beard, he's old enough to whatever. And then the third halacha is once you hit 18, basically at that point already, even if you can't grow a beard, then already the halacha is Siducha no matter what. It's complicated, but either way. Cotton kari b'Torah u'mitargim. A cotton, even though he's not chayiv in mitzvahs, he can read the Torah, which is very much in with what we were explaining, that the whole concept of Kriyas Torah to begin with is just to be Megilla the rabbin what's going on in the Torah. You don't have to be a gadol for that. U'mitargim, and as long as he understands the psukim, he could say over the targum. Aval eina peiros al shma, since he's not mitzvah in those mitzvahs yet, because he's a cotton, he cannot be mitzi the other ones. Ve'eina over lifnei hateva, he can't be mitzi people with chazar sashatz. Ve'eina noisias kapov, a cotton doesn't do v'nisias kapayim. How? Pecheach peiros hashma. What's a pecheach? Pecheach is machlekes. Most Rishonim understand pecheach to mean someone whose clothes are ripped. You could see his skin. There might be issues of erva, other things. Rashi says it means he's barefoot, or you could see his legs. The point is, it's not a kavod tzibur. Shorts maybe would probably be the simple read according to Rashi. U'mitargim. So the halacha is he can be peiros hashma because that's not considered really like a tzibur dika halacha. It's just something that's sort of done on the side in shul. You grab a couple of guys together and you do baruch hu for this chavra, but it's not like davening for the Amud. U'mitargim, same thing. Mitargim isn't a chosh of a kibbutz, so therefore we're allowed to do that. However,
so Paris Shema is the level below over Lufnei Teva, which is the full.
Yes. Aval eino koyre b'Torah, he can't lane. Ve'eino over Lufnei Teva, ve'eino noisias kapov, because these are all considered dinim of the congregation, and it would be a poor reflection on the congregation that they need to be represented by such a person, meaning it's a lack of kavod. Suma, a blind person, in the pashtas here we're talking about a suma that b'shnei einav. Peiros hashma, so he can be peiros hashma because we'll understand the Tanakama will obviously hold that he's mitzvah in the mitzvah, right? U'mitargim, and he can explain the psukim. Now it's not clear from here whether it means he can't lane. It's not referencing the other halachas, but a suma does those things.
He couldn't see the lane.
No, so that's the problem. So by laning, it would end up becoming a problem of you're not really reading. Yeah. What are you doing? You're saying about peh. But again, it's a difficult argument. I mean, I hear that's clearly what's pshat in the Mishnah, but less breira, like
it's not that it's less breira. It's that it wouldn't be Kriyas Torah. It would be just. He's announcing a shiur. Kriyas Torah means reading it from the
Ksav. Yeah. The Rabbi Yehuda Aimer Kol Shalei Ro'ah Me'oyreis Miyamav Einoi Peiros Al Shma. And Pri says it depends on when he was blind from when he was born versus if he was blind a little bit later, which is very interesting. So he's saying what? He's saying that if he was blind from when he was born, then he can't even do being Peiros Hashma because the bracha inside Peiros Hashma, the first bracha is Yoitzer Me'oyreis. He's never seen a sun, moon, and the stars. So how can he talk about the Yoitzer Me'oyreis? So therefore he says, Eina Peiros Al Shma. Tais over here brings up that this shita of Rabbi Yehuda is the one who holds in Kol Torah Kula that a summa is patur for mitzvahs. So he says, what do you have to come on to the whole idea if he was born blind versus getting blind later? He shouldn't be allowed to do this because according to Minig Bishlam, the Tanakama will hold that he's chayiv in mitzvahs. But Rabbi Yehuda is the shita who holds he's patur for mitzvahs. If he's patur for mitzvahs, then how could he be motzi anyone? Even if he was 10 years old when he became blind. Doesn't matter. Who cares that he could say, I saw a sun? If he's patur from mitzvahs, then how can he be motzi other people in Krishma? He's not chayiv in Krishma. He's not chayiv in Baruch. He's not chayiv in any of these things. How could he's like a cotton, no different. So Taisva says, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the summa is patur from all mitzvahs in the Torah, Taisva says, but he's still chayiv midrabanan. So and meaning therefore midrabanan he's chayiv, so that's enough of a chayiv to. The issue really is, and it's such an interesting thing, even beyond halacha, just to understand, if I were to say to you, find me a Jew who's 100% a Jew, who is not mitzvah in mitzvahs, ever. Meaning, he can live like a guy, and it's not a problem. The pashtus is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, a summa fits that bill. Meaning
as opposed
he's
to
a bardas.
A cherish is not a bardas, so you're not counting.
You don't count it. Yeah. Summa's a bardas. What's the pshat that
it was like an exemption?
Right.
You got
Meaning,
an exemption.
if you saw a cheresh and you said, "Oh, he's not keeping anything," I think the general assumption is people would say, "Well, what do you want?" I mean, he's now again, he halachically doesn't have das. Assuma can. I mean, you assume it could be Rosh Hashiva. There were very, very many chashav amirayim who were.
No one thought.
I believe it was not Rav Yosef. I forget which one it was. Rav Yosef. Yeah. But Rav Yosef was a blind person. He was a saginar. So and yet. No, I think there's a famous Gemara, maybe Tassi mentioned it over here, that he made a simcha over the fact that I forget exactly how the Gemara goes, but he made a simcha over the fact that that he was able to make a bracha as a mitzvah. There's a whole.
But it's only the Shitas Rabbi Yehuda who we may not pass him like. So you're asking just on that Shita.
Yeah, on that Shita. Now, it happens to be that I'm not 100% sure who we hold like, but I know that the discussion is a huge discussion in the Gedolei Achronim. The Turei Even here, the Shakasari in general, and the Rabbi Akiva Eiger, they want to conclude that Tosfos does not mean, this is the question, does Tosfos mean he's potter from mitzvahs, and that means even lois essays? That's the question. In Tosfos, we're discussing essays here, so who knows? But from Tosfos, it's mashma here and in other places that
he could eat tarfus.
And it's just saying, no, but he can't because...
But how is it mashma? Does Tosfos say that? Or maybe it's always understood.
So there's no raya one way or the other in Tosfos, but meaning the assumption is that whatever the svara behind Rabbi Yehuda's shita is to say that a sumas pater from mitzvahs will apply from essen and lois essays. Like, why should there be a distinction?
Maybe not.
So you have to look and see what.
It's easier not to do a los essay than to do an essay. If you're physically immobile, whatever, you can't do things, but it doesn't mean you have to eat tarfus.
Right. Okay, I hear that. But again, I think it'll come down to knowing what the reason why Rabbi Yehuda, what that is, which I'm not 100%
now, is
sure.
it so clear that someone who's chayiv v'drabanan can be motzi people who are chayiv v'doraisa?
That's also a discussion. Yeah.
So
the
Tosfos is here assuming
that it would work. Yeah.
Okay.
Now it could be we're not describing again with Pyrrhus as Shema, what in there really is min HaTorah.
Well, Shema itself,
but he's not doing that. Yeah. So we're just talking about the inyan of B'tzibur, which is learned out min HaTorah, but it's
two derabanan could be
it's okay. Right. Although Tosfos did mention earlier that may not be a good svara, because we saw earlier that he wanted to use the two derabanans of a cotton that's chayiv and chinuch to be mitzi. A gadol was only by Megilla. But either way, so Rabbi Akiva Eiger and the Turei Even, they want to bring up be mechiach from Tosfos, who says there's a chiv derabanan. I don't see the raya too stark because in this Tosfos he doesn't say it, but I believe there's other Tosfos in other places. Even on the bottom they quote the other Tosfos where they do talk about this, where Tosfos says he can make a bracha, meaning this summa can make a bracha, and how can you make a bracha? Asher kedishanu b'mitzvos of tzifanu. That's the way I think Rabbi Akiva Eiger asks it. The Turei Even asks it much more pashut. He asks it, I think, much more philosophically. If you tell me that Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that he's pater from mitzvahs, not only mitzvahs essay, but even mitzvahs lois essay, so then what's mechayev him to listen to the Rabbanan? Meaning, right, if I were to ask you, why are you even listening to the Rabbanan? It wouldn't be because, well, they're very smart, because Einstein's smart and you don't listen to him. It's because the Torah itself tells us you got to listen to the rabbis. Let's also this way, let's also that way.
Saying someone's not chayiv and Moshe says is not so plausible. It would mean he could be mizaneh.
Yeah,
he
100%.
could kill people.
No. So the question then becomes a philosophical question.
Yeah.
Which is, how do you understand why a guy has to keep Zayin mitzvahs b'nei noach? And what's the basis for that? Meaning, do they have a chiyuv atzloi saser? Obviously not. Or do they? Meaning if the Torah wasn't being given to them, how do we even start having the conversation? Meaning, what I mean is assuming
they were given the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach before the Torah. Meaning the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach comes from what was.
So in a certain sense, it would be. I think I remember reading somewhere that there's actually an idea like that. That there's an idea that says that since there's Zayin Mitzvahs Bnei Noach that already exist by Goyim, if it would be that Rabbi Yehuda's din would be true, that it would apply even to lois essays, it still would mean that the summa would be chayiv in those mitzvahs of Zayin Mitzvahs Bnei Noach,
that helps.
Which would help because that really would cover a lot of the things you're trying to address. Znus and
but once you're saying that, you might as well say they're chayiv in Ramach. No, Shasa Los essays.
So that I think is spoken out by some later achronim to try to explain. I think the Rebbe Chanan has a svara like this, if I remember, where he says something like that. Meaning they come at it like this: the Ramban in the Sefer HaMitzvahs argues with the Rambam what the mitzvah of what is leisaser. The Rambam understands, and this is the way we quote it all the time, is that why do you have to listen to the rabbis? Because it says leisaser min smile. So since the Torah itself is telling you listen to the rabbis. So it's almost like every
Sounds
Derabanan
like every Derabanan
is really a Deraisa, which is
paradoxical.
with the Rambam. The Rambam Shita holds that a Suffolk he holds Suffolk Deraisa, L'chumra is only a Din Derabanan. Why? Because if I have a Din Deraisa, that Din Deraisa is a Din Derabanan, and then every Din Derabanan is also a Din Deraisa. So it's not so clear exactly.
Sounds almost like Derabanan should be stronger,
right?
Which also implies sometimes.
But only like Mechvivas or maybe because of external svaras.
I agree.
But okay, so that's the sheet of the Rambam. Let's keep us balabatish. The Rambam saying that loisasser is why we have to keep the mitzvahs. Listen to the rabbis. The Ramban doesn't say that. The Ramban himself says that that's not what loisasser is, and he says. I mean, I'm not 100% sure if I'm quoting this properly, but the way the Ramban understands why we have to listen to Chachamim, he understands it that it's an implicit reality that comes from the penumbra of the Chumash. Meaning, if you clearly read the Chumash, it's very clear there's something called Ratzon Hashem, and that Ratzon Hashem is Moifia in the leaders of Klal Yisrael. It's not something that has to necessarily be explicitly stated. It's something that comes from the, again, I don't have a better word than penumbra. It comes from the observations of the Torah. So if that's the case, then obviously when the Chachamim come and say X, Y, and Z, you got to listen to X, Y, and Z. So that you can get out of this raya from. But the person they go to town on this, trying to figure out exactly how could it be that a summa. To me, I just find it interesting because you don't oftentimes see in a sugya and halacha a scenario where a full-fledged Jew who's got complete das, who's learning Torah potentially. I mean, you're talking about, goes out to lunch with his chavrusa, and he could sit down and have a bacon cheeseburger, and it's no problem. Not only no problem, maybe it's a mitzvah. I mean, once it's not usher to eat that, then what? Then already you have a mila of what do you mean? Hashem put it in the world. Why shouldn't they? Right? Meaning, and what does that mean when we talk about eating tarfus? So does that also mean now that the tumah that like you start thinking about all of these things, not being mitzvah in mitzvahs? Does that also mean that my neshama is a different neshama now? It becomes a little bit complicated to me.
Anyone who says that it doesn't include losa says the burden of proof is on him because it's easier to read.
The Minchas Chinuch says that's what Taisus says. That's what you have real people saying it. It's not like it's.
But I say the burden of proof is on them because you could read it. He's not mitzvah to do mitzvahs. Meaning, what do we mean? He's not mitzvah in mitzvahs. He's not mitzvah to do things. Right. So that ends up being a says.
Right. I hear it. Listen, it's interesting to me because it's such a radical idea, and it's a radical idea being put forth by very, very mainstream Gedolei Poskim. Chassidus says it, the Noda B'Yehuda says it. Like you're talking about real Poskim.
I remember a discussion when I was in high school that apparently Achronim look at the question of literally cannibalism, not Eiver Nachai, but eating a dead person, and apparently there's no source for it. So some people say, well, there's no source, so it's allowed technically. Others say it's penumbras, meaning it reminded
similar
me
idea.
Much. Yeah. Of course.
Right. It's a little bit Ma'ain, sort of a more contemporary Shiloh when it came to electricity. When electricity became a question, everyone understood that this is going to be us on Shabbos. And not because the rabbis were instituting some power, but they understood that this is going to go at the heart of Menucha on Shabbos if we start allowing it to. But they couldn't necessarily always point to an exact, half of them didn't understand the Metzias, right, until it was explained to them. So you have Machlokes, it's Boina, it's Havara.
Right.
I mean, and I'm not saying that there's not a tremendous.
They were finding a way.
It was very clear, if you read the Tshuvas, it's very clear that not chas v'shalom that there was an agenda. It's just b'chachmasam they understood this was Asur on Shabbos. This does not. Now, how do I know that it's not? Can I prove it to you? It's very difficult. And there are plenty of quote unquote rabbis intelligent people, Yodea Torah even I would say, who've attempted to try to poke holes through these arguments in order to be able to say, no, you can open a fridge on Shabbos because it's not really electricity. Electricity is not really a malacha. And really it's a derabanan, it's a b'makam. They start finding ways of, and you can completely uproot. I mean, the entire musig of muktzah was instituted in order to prevent that. Meaning an intelligent person could say, well, I only have 39 restrictions, so let me just contort myself in such a way where I could find, well, that's a malacha gufa, but it's a derabanan, that's a double derabanan. If I could rely on the Rambam that says that b'makam this and that's b'makam that, and it's a tzarich this, and Rav Megilla on that. So then all of a sudden you find I can ask a guy, and really it's not asking a guy. If I'm just meramis, before you know it, you can have a TV on Shabbos.
Yeah.
I had a guy when I was in high school. He used to, his parents, they had a couple of TVs in the house. They would leave one TV on upstairs, another TV on downstairs, another TV on there, and they had it where it was like the football game would be on upstairs, the movies would be on downstairs, and depending upon which form of entertainment you wanted to not have to deal with Shabbos from,
I was
that's
going,
the room you went to. But he wouldn't, Chas would never touch the.
I was going to school a little earlier when no one would leave a TV on the whole Shabbos. I guess it just wasn't viewed as something. But there was a concept of having it on a Shabbos clock. Like it goes on at the time. I think they didn't want to waste it. Like
Moshe has a tshuva that he talks about Shabbos clocks, where he says it seems he limits it only to lights.
Right.
What kind of argument is that? Meaning, if you really think about it, and the teretz is that it comes back to this halacha.
It's a meta halacha.
Yeah,
argument.
exactly.
That's all of what we're talking about. Yeah, I understand.
All right, let's hop right. Okay, so it says in the Gemara like this. So what are we saying in the Mishnah? We have the person who's a mafter benavi. He is peiros al shma. My time. What is the reason why we
give him these
kavits? My time. Repapa arma mishum kavid. Rashi says lahavir lifnei hateva hoyelu mamtzi atzmai ledavar she'enoi kvoidoi tiknu loy zu lekavid. Meaning, it's like I said before, we don't want him to feel like he's getting the short end of the bargain over here. So mishum kavid, we give it to him. Rabba bar Shimi Amar mishum de asil in suye, that it's since the person who is being oile for haftarah, if he's good, it could lead to a machlekes. What's the machlekes? Because the person who's being given the haftarah, and then there's the person who's going to do, someone else is going to get the shots. So the person who's being given the haftarah is going to say, "You give me this. Look at him. He gets to go up and be over lifnei table." So Gemara says, "My beinayu." It sounds like they're really basically saying the same thing. Gemara says, "Ika beinayu the ovid bechinam." What happens if the baal tefillah is doing it for free, right? If he's doing it for free, then right. If he's the ovid bechinam and he's not taking any schar for it, then it wouldn't make a difference one way or the other. There isn't going to be a problem of machlekes. But if it's mishum kavod, it's going to be mishum kavod, and so therefore that would be chapanaf gemina. Continues the Gemara. Tanan v'im hayakatan aviv oy rabbi oyvern al yadoy. So amos mishum nitzuye katan bar nitzuye. So ask the Gemara like this. 1 second, I just lost my spot. So what does it say in the Mishnah? If he's a katan and he's over lifnei hateva, if he's a katan and he's a kohen, so he can't duchen. So it says aviv oy rabbi oyvern al yadoy. So we're talking about a katan that's also the one who's the bal maftir. And we're saying the reason why he gets this thing is because of a special covet that he didn't get a good enough covet by being the one who's maftir. Ask the Gemara. If you say that it's because of a machlekes, a katan's going to start fighting in shul with the other guy in shul over the fact that he didn't get to have this covet, he didn't get that covet. My son barely opens his mouth. He's not going to say anything.
No one would care.
No one would care. Yeah. So Gemara katan bar netzuya. Gemara says elamai mishum covet. Elamai mishum covet. So you have a raya that it's like the first shita. Gemara says no. Katan bar covetu. That also doesn't work.
Yeah.
Well, so Ika covered of it, rabbi. So then Hakanam, you'll say the same shtickle. Ika nitzuya of nitzuya rabbi. Pechech peiros al shma, person who either wearing shorts or he's whatever he's revealed. Boy minei ula bar rav me'abaye cotton pechech ma'ush yikra b'toira. Meaning the question here is a question of erva. You have a cotton, so he's going up and dressed in an inappropriate way. So mishum erva ma'ush yikra b'toira. When it says, what do you mean? Ask the question. What do you have to ask? The question is a cotton and he's dressed like this pechech. Why not say if a cotton can go up without wearing any clothes? Right? Elamai what? My time alone. Mishum kavod tzibur. How can I mishum kavod tzibur? It's going to be a problem.
This is beyond our scope, but maybe for like a 1-year-old, we say there's no erva, but for a 12-year-old, we would normally say
of course,
there is erva. So they're using the word cotton as if it's synonymous with no erva.
Right.
It's a little
bit difficult. Yeah. Right. Yeah, especially, unless you're talking about a 5-year-old.
There's some cutoff, right?
And the pashtus is that whatever that cutoff is, he's not going and doing that Torah, right? So
it's a little
that's a fair point.
Our understanding of those halachas.
Continues Gemara. Suma peiros al shma. Said in the Mishnah that a blind person could do the priest of shma. Tanya Amar Rabbi Yehuda, who said that the suma's not going to do the being peiros of shma, and the reason is because of Yitzim Eiros. Harbeit Sofu Lidrosh B'Merkava V'Loiro also B'Yameim. So it's a kasha they asked on him. They said there are plenty of people who are Doirish B'Maisa Merkava. They never saw the Merkava, right? V'Loiro B'Yameim. Meaning And so too over here, let him say Yotzim Iris. He doesn't.
They use their mind.
They use their mind to conceptualize it.
Yeah.
More said for Yehuda, Hasam Avanta Deliba Talia Mills. What do you bring me a raya from over there? That's talking about where you need to think about what's going on. You don't actually have to see it. So he thought about it and he understood exactly what's going on. But here you're talking about Hana. Did he have a benefit from the sun? Can he appreciate light? Can he appreciate that? No, he can't appreciate it. Never saw it. So therefore, he's parted from that. Rabbanan, who say that no, he says, Rabbanan Isle Hana Rabbi Yossi. What's the Hana? Hana is like Rabbi Yossi. The Tanya Rabbi Yossi called Yomai Hayisim Mitzdoyer al Mikrozeh. He says, I never understood the pasuk. Pasuk is Vayisim Mashesh B'Tzarayim Kasher Yemashesh Ha'iver Ba'afela, which is really a little too much. A blind person in the dark can be the same as a blind person in the light. What does it matter whether the Ramachal says this right at the beginning of the Mesil Sasharim, and then the Mefarshim explain a lot on that. Is that it's one thing to walk in the dark when you don't know what's going on, but what about if you're walking as a blind man in the dark, even other people can't help you, and that's much worse. That's what Gemara says. Right. And it explained it. What was the Ma'aseh? Very interesting, right? I was completely in the dark. No one would have been able to see me, and l'chayra, I wouldn't have been able to see this summa. Meaning, how did I see him? Because he was holding a flame. He was holding some sort of a torch. Right? Now, it's the whole story is a pellet. I mean, what do you mean? I wouldn't have seen you. I mean, he couldn't put two and two together, right? He says,
one hand he has his cane, the other hand he has a torch.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Amarli calls man shavuki biyadi b'nei adam roya noisiu mitzila noisi min apchosin or min akutzin or min barkonim. Basically, I don't have any obstacles that I'm going to run into, and therefore I'm going to be okay. Masha ain't cane without the fire. You're right. I'm going to trip, whether I'm going to trip or I'm not going to trip. But if I can put the light on, and now you could see where I'm going, you'll say, "Hey, watch out! Watch where you're going." Whatever. Yeah. Okay. Fine. So meaning what? And what's the Gemara answering? The Gemara is saying the Chachamim are saying that that's enough of a hana that a blind person could say Yotzei Ma'ayros, because even though he's not personally benefiting it from his appreciation for the light, but he is benefiting from it that way. And I find it interesting that Bechlal, this is a question of hana. What do we mean when we say that to say Yotzei Ma'ayros is what is it? Berchas Hanenin? Right. Very strange bracha. It's still a Berchas Hashevach. And if you can't see the light, then how can you be Meshabech Kodesh Baruch Hu over it? Unless you have an appreciation for that. Unless you want to say, like anything else, there are a lot of shvachim that we say to Hashem that we don't necessarily appreciate or experience. But okay, be Mishabech Kadosh Baruch Hu.
Right. I was thinking that also, that it's not so different from the Merkava, because if you appreciate the importance of light, you can be Mishabech without seeing it.
Right.
Like, where does this hana come into the picture? Right. Exactly. But
and there are so many other areas where this is relevant. Meaning, if you'd ask a blind person, what do you care if there's light for? He says, what do you mean? I live in the world. I need that other people should have light so that they can, build roads and do light's needed. Obviously, is the Gemara trying to understand what's the benefit of an Iver to have light? I mean, he himself can't see, Mazda, but there's a million other reasons why the world that he lives in requires light.
Unless you understand somehow that, like, we have Birchos Hariyah, which are a type of Shevach for Hashem. You see lightning, so if you don't see it, you don't say the bracha.
Correct.
So maybe the Gemara was saying that somehow.
Well, that's clearly that's the dion and the Tanakh and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is saying no, you don't say it. But I'm saying to call it a hana, that to me.
But he didn't think it was a birkas hanan, and even in the Hava, he thought it was some sort of shevach that you have to get the hana from. Right. So that distinction.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah. Okay, Mishnah goes weiter. Next Mishnah. Kohen sheyesh biyadav mumin lo yises kapav. A kohen that has mumin on his hands. We'll go with Rashi. It means that you have something on your hands that make people want to look at it, whatever the mum is. And therefore, it's going to be a problem because, like Rashi quotes from the Gemara that says that you shouldn't look on the hands of a kohen. And Mistakol Kehanim, he says, is at the time that they're noisei kapeim, the Shechina is, so to speak, on their fingertips. A person shouldn't look at the Shechina, can make him blind, which I think is maybe just interesting why this is being brought right after we had a Mishnah that talked about a Summa. Maybe that's the little bit of the smichas of Parshas over here. Kohen sheyesh biyadai mumin lo yises kapav. Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, af misha hayadav tzivuais sitim, even if he had his hands were stained a certain color, whatever it is, lo yisa es kapav mipnei sheha'am mistakum bay. And the chiddush over here is that when it's a kohen that has actual mumin, lo yisa es kapav, he shouldn't do it. Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, af misha hayadav tzivuais sitim. Not really 100% sure what the chiddush here is of Rabbi Yehuda over over the Tanakama, but okay. Either way,
It's
does it say over there
it's-
what the?
Well, I don't know if he said it's not a mum. It's just another. It's
Right.
not like
Meaning this isn't it's
he
not a
works-
halachic thing.
right.
It's just a practical matter.
He works in a city. Well, we'll get to this.
Yeah.
Works in the city, but he works with this dye, and his hands end up dyed. So it's not a mum, but
It almost sounds like if you're a kohen and you're a plumber or something,
Right.
and your hands are all dirty, your fingernails are all dirty, and you're gonna go up there. Forgetting covet, it's just people are gonna stare at your hands,
Right.
and if they're staring at your hands, we're trying to keep your eyes off of it. I do believe other Rishonim speak out that it's not like Rashi. Rashi says that it's because of the Shechina on the Yadayim.
Right,
They
right.
bring it's more a weiter a halacha in Kavod Tzibur that they should be getting a bracha from such a person with mumen, and that makes things a lot easier.
That's
Meaning
another
little-
element.
yeah.
It's a samach at the end, by the way. It's tis.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I read Sitim?
Yeah,
Sitis.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to see.
Yeah.
And it's not a word we know.
Yeah. I think there's actually Girsas here. If you take a look in the Rishonim, they say over here,
Well, some of them say istis because really Hebrew words never start with like st. There has to be a vowel.
vowel beforehand to reflect it. Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. Tana mumin sha'amru b'fan of yadav v'raglav. We're only talking, and this is really the Gemara, I think, effectively saying the idea that you just said. What we mean to say over here is we don't mean mumin with a capital mem. We mean mumin that show up in the places where people would see it.
Mhm.
And again, whether you go with Rashi that it's because of the Shechina, or you go with Tosfos because it's covered at Tzibur, like Tosfos is a little bit better because covered at Tzibur makes more sense if you could see it. Meaning, who cares that a guy has a mum on his feet if the whole issue is looking at people's fingers? So I think they explain in Rashi. I think Rashi might even say it is that, but if he has problems with his feet, it's going to make people look to see what else he's got, and therefore they're going to come to his hands. But either way, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Yodov by Hakoniyos, like they have spots on it. Lo Yisa Eskapov, he shouldn't do it. Tanya Nam Yehochi Yodov by Hakoniyos, Lo Yisa Eskapov, Akumois Akushois, Zarkusais Akushois, Lo Yisa Eskapov, basically crooked or crippled or somehow deformed. His hands, though, you shouldn't do it. Again, these are all the same idea, either because of covet or because of Shlina on his hands. Ravasi, Chefani, Veishani. These are different areas. People come from these places. Lo Yisa Eskapov, and the reason we're going to see is because people from there, they're mahapech, their aleph and their ayins. And although Ashkenazim, really, there is almost no difference between an aleph and an ayin. If you speak to a Sephardi who speaks properly, or even an Arab who has an appreciation for that guttural ayin,
Ayin has a real sound.
yeah,
As opposed to the aleph, which is just
a silent letter,
emptiness,
right. So it almost has like an sound. So
Right.
that sound is different than an aleph. It can literally change the difference in words where there's an ayin versus an aleph. So Tanya Nami Hochi, that's a problem because Ein Marilov Ne'ateva Anshe Beis Sha'an.
That's the Veishani.
Yeah, same thing. V'lei anshe beis chayfa, v'lei anshe tiv'oinen, mipnei shekayrin la'alfin einin, and let's read it the proper way. Shekayrin la'alfin einin, or la'einin alfin. Right? They mix them up, and therefore, now what's the problem with that? So Rashi speaks
By the
out.
way, it's well known, and you probably know it, that the reason things like Sodom and Gomorrah have a G is because the ayin-
inability.
Yeah, so
Just-
there's a number of words like that
Where
have
the-
a G
Right.
because
That's the closest we have to them all.
Yeah, but it wasn't us. It was like way back in Greek times. They heard Jews saying that word, and that's what it sounded like to them.
Right.
And so that's the way they transcribed it, which
Yeah,
again
right,
shows
right.
that they did pronounce it.
Right. Meaning specifically that the ayin gets turned into a gimel. Right.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I'll think of 2 or 3 other examples.
Yeah,
but
my brain's
they-
already going there. But okay,
they're
yeah.
not popping into my head.
Yeah,
right now.
let's okay. So Amr le Rabbi Chia, the Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe. Rabbi Chia, who we'll see in a moment, was someone who had this problem. He himself could not say an aleph. Sorry, he couldn't. He would mix up his alephs and his ayins. Sorry, no. Let me say that correctly. Rabbi Chia didn't have an aleph ayin problem. He had a hey ches problem, right? So he couldn't say Chanukah. He couldn't say a ch sound.
Right.
The irony, I think, is that his name was Rabbi Chia, right? Which I actually think I think there's a pshat in the Gemara that's predicated on this idea. Let's read the story, which is a Pelagic story. Amalei Rabbi Chia Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe. So we have 3 people here.
Because he wasn't nice. He
Yeah.
was a little mean to.
Right. So Rabbi Chia was talking to Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi.
Right.
Ilmale Atolevi. And here, this Ilmale is
Means
with a yid.
not-
If you
not-
are,
not,
right.
yeah.
This is a thesis we saw. I think it was 2000 ago, 3,000 ago.
Oh, this just makes the distinction
Yeah.
between the positive. and
Yeah, right on the
negative.
Mishnah. Taisa says, El Mole Mikra Kosev with an aleph. So Taisa says when it's with an aleph, it means if it were not.
Mhm.
When it's with a yud, it means if it is, meaning
Yep.
right.
Yep, I knew it, but I didn't know Tosfos
Yeah.
said it.
So Amarle Rechila Reb Shimon Bar Rebbe Il Mole Ato Levi Poisel Ata Min Haduchen, meaning from a Levi who would be in the Beis Hamikdash during the Maisa of the Karban, during the Hakrava, would be standing on the side on the platform singing, and he's saying that you. And the irony is, Reb Chia wasn't a Levi, but he's saying if you were a Levi, you would have been puzzle for the Shira. Why? Mishum de Ave Kolcha, because you have a thick, deep voice. You don't have a pretty voice.
Mhm.
And therefore, why is he saying this? I don't know. Asa Omer Leila Avua. So this is what Rabbi Chia said to Reb Shimon Bar Rebbe. Reb Shimon went to his father, meaning Rebbe, and told him what Rabbi Chia had just told him, that he doesn't have a nice
He
voice.
went crying. He might have been young. We don't know the details.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Amarle Zil Eimale Ksha'ata Magia Eitzel V'chikisi LaHashem says, go tell him, meaning he who I know can't say a ches,
Mhm.
go tell him when he gets to V'chikisi LaHashem, Lo Nimseis Mecharef Megadef, meaning the word chikisi becomes hikisi, and now chas shalom to say that a person's going to be makah Hashem, is going to hit Hashem, can't be. Punish Hashem, hurt Hashem, can't be. It's got to be chikisi Hashem. You're waiting for Hashem. The jump from ches to hey. So he was it almost sounds like he was pouring salt in his.
It's like turnabout is fair play.
Yeah,
saying,
exactly.
Saying,
yeah.
You did this, I'll do it. And
Yeah.
It's
So I wanted to say, I think a little bit, just taking that just to its, a little bit further, is you said the way he expressed it was ilmole ato Levi, right? If we'd be hanging out in the Beis Hamikdash and you would be a Levi, you'd be puzzle as a Levi. I think he's saying back to him, he's saying you'd be puzzle as Reb Chia. Your own name, like you can't even. You're telling my son that if he was a Levi, he couldn't. Well, if you were a Reb Chia, which you're not because you can't even say your name. Right? Now, Tosfos over here speaks out that Reb Chia could say it because he brings a raya from Gemara. The Gemara is in Baba Mitzia that is it a raya in Baba Mitzia? Yeah. Kasha kivin shlehayu yachol loymar ches im ken heichai ridu Rebbe lifnei hateva, which is the irony here is Rebbe who's the one who's telling him go tell Reb Chia that he can't say the chikisi. Rebbe would say to Reb Chia, go daven for the Amud. We need you. We need your tefillah to go save us. How can he do it? He can't say a ches. So he says over here that b'doichak he could. If he really needed to make the ches sound, he could push it. And you can imagine this sounds like almost like someone who has maybe a stutter or someone has some sort of a speech defect where it's not that they can't do it. It's just that for whatever reason, the connection between the brain and the mouth is not clean, and so therefore they really have to focus on forcing their body to do something that does not feel normal.
He says, and again, this is a little different. He says that the people from Bavel didn't pronounce the ches right, and it sounded like maybe because
So this wasn't a speech defect as much as it was.
That's what he's suggesting, and all the people from Bavel, which makes it a little less
right. So the poskim do speak out that although we generally speaking don't want someone to go up to the to daven for the Amud if they have a speech defect, if the way they speak is the way everyone in that community speaks, then obviously if that's the way it is, it's not a defect.
It's their communities.
Exactly. Okay, let's just go shtickle weiter here. We'll get down to the Mishnah and then we'll call it a day. So what does it say over here? Amar Rav Huna Zavlagan lo yisa es kappa. Rashi says Zavlagan, I think, is a person who gets very teary-eyed. He gets a lot of tears in his eyes. He would go ahead and he would be nice kapayim, even though he was such a person. And again, as Zavlagan, you have to understand why. Why Taka? The Pashtus is it's just not a covet. I'm assuming. What does Rashi say? Zavlagan.
I guess they would also look up at the person,
right?
Even though they cover their heads, but I guess they would look up.
Yeah. And so he says, no, that's very different. Hahu dosh be'irei havi. He was very recognizable. People were not so bothered.
They were used to him.
Yeah, they were very used to him, so therefore they didn't become. Other Rishonim speak out that it also has what to do with like a hesach hadas, that in order to have the bracha, you don't want people to be distracted. Either way, Tanya Nami Hachi Zavlagan lo yisa kapavim hayadosh beirei mutter. Amr Rabbi Yochanan summa ba'achas me'en of lo yisa kapavim. Yochanan says that a summa, not a double summa, where you can't see at all, but he's blind only in one eye. Lo yisa es kapov. He shouldn't do nisias kapayim. And again, l'chura, the reason will be a little bit more of a raya to the shittas rishonim that it's a kavod atzibur, because really, if it's why would I be looking at his hands just because he can't see?
Sometimes a sumo in one eye, the eye turns and looks strange, or the eye is gray.
Yeah, but why would I obviously wouldn't be looking at his hands? It's,
look at him,
yeah.
so then you see his hands.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah. We said panav.
Panav
We
before.
didn't just say.
Yeah. The same answer. Fine. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Misha Yadav Tzvua is Loyisa es kapov. It said in the Mishnah that a person's hands who are, let's say, stained in some way, he shouldn't be nice at kapayim. Tana, the Bryce says, Imroiv Anshi Ha'ir Melachtan Bekach, then it's mutter. Meaning, if everyone's a plumber and everyone has dirty hands, then no one's looking at dirty hands. Funny. Same idea of what we said before.
I don't mind if you do the last mission.
No, I'm going to pick because it's it's just a new Indian. That's all.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. Plus, I try to keep the time.
Okay.